Okay. Great. We are live on Facebook. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the people who are live in the chat here. And thank you to anybody who has found me on Facebook. And we are recording this for posterity. We'll be putting it up on our YouTube channel. Those of you who have found me in the future, hopefully things are doing well then. The future seems a little uncertain now, but I hope you are all doing well. For those of you who don't know, my name's Steve Owens. I'm a candidate for state representative, the 29th Middlesex District, which covers most of Watertown and West Cambridge and parts of North Cambridge. This is the 5th weekly town hall that we've been doing to talk about some of the issues that are important to people in the district and statewide and nationally, really. First, we had Eric Shupin from CHAPA talk about housing. We had Liz Goss, immigration attorney, talk about immigration issues. We had Representative John Santiago talking about the intersection of COVID and the work that the legislature is doing. And then our last was former Transportation Secretary Jim Aloisi. We talked about transportation issues. So those are all available and archived on the YouTube page. I hope you'll check them out. But today we are honored to have former candidate for Lieutenant Governor, current Chair of the Voter Protection Corps, Quentin Palfrey. Quentin, I met through his campaign for Lieutenant Governor. I think we were running in a lot of the same Democratic ward and town committee circles through that time. And Quentin, it's really great to see you. I'm glad that you're continuing the activism and doing this work. I'd love to hear about the organization a little bit.
Yeah, thanks so much, Steve, and thanks for having me. Thanks everybody for joining. I'd love to talk about a few things tonight. One is the set of challenges that I think that we face right now as a nation and as a state to making sure that we have a free and fair election. We can spend a little bit of time talking about what happened yesterday with the governor signing an important piece of legislation. And I do want to make sure that we have some time to talk about why it's really important to elect Steve as a state representative, why we need progressive leadership on Beacon Hill for some of the challenges that are coming next. But let me sort of step back and just talk about the challenge we face right now to our democracy, because I do think that this is a really a perfect storm of challenges to our democracy. And first, I think that it's important to contextualize some of what we're talking about within a larger framework of racial injustice. So for many years, we have had essentially two election systems in this country. If you're a person of color, if you move around a lot, if you're a younger person, if you're homeless, you face obstacles to registering and voting and having your vote count that just aren't faced by folks like myself, who tend to vote in about 10 minutes or less as an affluent 40-something white person in Weston, Massachusetts. And I think that we have for many decades had many hours-long lines in African-American communities, voter purges, voter challenges. And so this is a problem that we've faced in our democracy for a long time. We now also have a president who weaponizes lies about voter fraud in order to raise obstacles to registering and voting. And so one of the parties in our system, and unfortunately the President of the United States and the Attorney General of the United States, have decided that their path to victory lies in making it harder for some people to vote. We have foreign adversaries. There's good evidence to suggest interfered in the last election, every reason to be worried that they will interfere in this one. We have a pandemic that has made some of the traditional ways that people vote harder. some of the ways that people register harder. And then we have a president who has made it clear that he will contest any election that doesn't go his way. So we have a lot of problems, and I think it is not an exaggeration to say that the future of our democracy hinges on the question of whether a series of state and local officials can ensure that the problems we've seen across the country in Georgia and Nevada and DC and Philadelphia and in Wisconsin over the course of the spring don't recur in November. So I think we've got a big set of challenges.
Yeah, there's certainly no shortage of issues there. I want to just go back to some of the stuff that you were talking about. I was reading the report that the Brennan Center for Justice did very recently that said that Black voters and Latino voters on average wait 45 minutes longer or 46 minutes longer to vote than white voters. And I got to tell you, just like you said, I don't think I've ever waited 45 minutes to vote in my entire, in all the years I've been voting. I don't maybe I've waited for 15 minutes at the outset, but I feel that I've never had this experience, and the fact that we have this separate the separate experience that Black and Latino and voters of color have is just something that we can't accept anymore, especially now.
It's an affront to our democracy, and just as we're awakening to the challenge of police brutality and the disparate impact in our criminal justice system and our policing system, we need to have the same kind of awakening to the sort of apartheid level differences between the experiences that people of color have registering and voting and the experiences that folks in other communities have. And it's not tolerable in our democracy. Some of the causes of those problems result from inequalities in resources. Some of them relate to local election administration, and some of them relate to intentional voter suppression. But the net result of that is that certain communities have much more difficult time having their voices heard in our government. And that's intolerable in democracy.
Yeah, and how much of that is related to the fact that voting is done, the voter administration of elections is done, sometimes the municipality level is what directs those resources. Sometimes the county level, and the patchwork system that we've cobbled together over the past 200 and change years in the United States. How much of it is related to that, and how much is would you say?
I think that it's definitely a patchwork system, and the problems that voters face are very, very idiosyncratic to where they live. And unfortunately, the solutions to the problems are therefore very local. So the kinds of things that we do, say in New Hampshire, to help students vote are very different from the kinds of things we need to do in Georgia to make sure that African Americans don't run into those obstacles. The kind of problems we've seen in Florida are different from the kinds of problems we see in Ohio. And so as you try to craft solutions, you need to be very locally informed, not just about the laws, which differ from state to state and county to county, but also to what are the levers that you can pull, what are the solutions that you can devise to some of these problems. And one of the things that we've learned, so this is my fifth presidential cycle working on voter protection issues. And one of the things we've learned is that the problems are not solvable at the time when the cavalry comes. So we tend to have tens of thousands of people coming out of the woodwork in October saying, put me in, coach, tell me how I can help with this election. And we tend to put, 80 or 90,000 monitors into polling places all across the country, particularly in battleground states. But the problem is that the problems that they encounter are the result of stuff that happened 6 months before, or 8 months before, or years before. And so you kind of have this asymmetry between where things are solvable and where you kind of have those resources. And one of the things that the group that I've founded tries to do is get a little more upstream, right? Identify the problems that we're likely to have with these lines or these purges at a very local level and try and pull the levers that you can to solve those problems in Mecklenburg County or Philadelphia County or Harris County or wherever you're going to be, because the problems need to be solved at that level and on that time scale.
And that's why you guys got started on this so early in the 2020 cycle. And we've seen, throughout the presidential primaries, problems in Milwaukee and Philadelphia, in Tennessee. Is there an effort to make sure that, what's the effort to make sure that those are not repeated come November, in places like, Milwaukee, for example, where the lines were out the door during.
I think that you need to see that as a blaring warning sign, right? So you look at the polls and you think, Joe Biden is in a good situation. And then you look at, the prediction markets, right? And they think, well, maybe it's a little closer than that. I think that represents sort of a fear, right? That this is not going to be a free and fair election. And that the greatest threat to the Democrats taking back the White House and the Democrats taking back the Senate is that voters will not be able to vote equally. I am quite worried. I think that you need to sort of think about voting in the coronavirus era as an all of the above strategy. So I am all in on the notion that voting by mail is an important piece of the solution. We've had very good experiences in the states that have gone to a vote by mail system. It's increased turnout for both parties. And it's really important. And the president lies about it. And the reason the president lies about it, because it makes it harder for him to suppress the vote. I want you to be absolutely clear, the vote by mail is part of the solution. That said, if you think about who is most likely to vote by mail and who is most likely to vote in person, the people who are most likely to vote in person are African Americans, young people, the homeless, and Native Americans. Okay, so if you think about how vote by mail has been implemented in the past, the high watermark of how vote by mail has been used in the country in the past is 23%. It will be likely considerably higher than that. But 88% of African Americans voted in person the last time, and we expect them to vote at a higher rate in the fall. And that's been clear throughout the primary. So if you do not protect in-person voting options, you will have even more of a disparate impact on the very communities that have faced the most disenfranchisement in the past. So what do we look at? Well, one of them is poll workers. Okay, so if you want to know why there are lines, one of the main reasons is there aren't enough human beings standing at the front of those lines. There aren't enough machines. There aren't enough physical spaces. Okay, recruiting poll workers has always been a problem. The Election Assistance Commission has done some studies on this, and it's always, the majority of polling locations have trouble recruiting poll workers. But more than 50% of the people who work as poll workers are over the age of 60. So during the pandemic, this is going to be a particularly large challenge. So we need right now, 4 months before the election, to make a major priority of making sure that there are enough human beings volunteering in polling locations all over the country so that we can keep those lines down. And if you want to talk about the scale of that, we need 900,000 people. It's about the same scale as the decennial census, okay? We need 900,000 people, and we're probably not gonna have as many senior citizens. So we're gonna need young people. We're gonna need to figure out how to recruit them. One of the solutions that local election officials are turning to is consolidating polling places. So they don't have as many poll workers, and they're worried that some of the polling places can't be safe. So what they do is they shrink the number of polling locations. So in Wisconsin, so you guys remember seeing on CNN or other cable news stations those really long lines in Milwaukee. Well, they went from 180 polling places to 5. Right? It's a very heavily African-American community. Some of the other parts of the state did not consolidate as much. Well, when you consolidate that many people into 5 polling locations, you get really long lines, and you get a very serious threat of contagion of the virus. But then, a month later, in Philadelphia, 77% of the polling locations closed. We had 23% of the 2016 primary polling locations open. So we need to push back against this notion that the solution is to close down a lot of polling places and consolidate them, because what you're going to see is lines. And if you have lines, people aren't going to be safe, and people aren't going to vote. And the people who are going to be most affected are going to be African Americans.
And
so
it's a self repeating cycle, right? If I say I'm closing down polling places, then I know there are going to be lines. And if we keep talking about the lines, well, then people aren't even going to bother showing up to be in those lines as well. And I've seen the statistics that show just the drop in participation as well. So it's not just that the same number of people are waiting in a long line. It's that people aren't showing up, or they're giving up, or they're not, their votes are not counted.
That's absolutely right. And the evidence is extremely clear that the longer the lines, the lower the turnout. When election officials are trying to suppress the vote, this is what they do. So when the Secretary of State of Georgia ran for governor, Kemp is now the governor, ran against Stacey Abrams, his strategy was to consolidate African-American polling locations into white communities, right? He wanted fewer polling locations. He wanted them to be farther away from the African-American communities. He wanted to be longer lines, right? And he very successfully was able to engineer that, and that cost Stacey Abrams the Georgia governorship in 2018. Sometimes consolidation of polling locations is not done for nefarious purposes, but the effect is the same. If you consolidate them, if you make it harder for people to vote, if you make the lines longer, they're less likely to vote. They're much more likely to drop out of those lines. I mean, who can wait 4, 5, 6 hours? I mean, if you looked at what happened a couple weeks ago, both in Nevada and in Georgia, the last voter voted 5, 6 hours after the polling place was closed. It's just not a way to run an election. And it's a very successful way of making it harder for certain people to vote and of influencing whose voice is heard.
Yeah. And I do want to go back to another point about election day voting. I want to talk a little bit about what the new law that was passed yesterday, signed yesterday. But one of the things that's important here is, the visually impaired it's extremely difficult for them to vote by mail. And we have in Watertown, we have the machines that have the speakers, and you can get the ballots read to you. So we realize that there are communities that are by necessity not going to be able to vote by mail, and we want to make sure that that the election day experience is safe for them in these COVID times. What steps do you think, and this will kind of talk about the things that we're hoping for the Secretary of State, the Secretary Galvin will be able to do for September and November here. How do you make a polling place safe? What steps should you take to make sure that the poll workers are protected, and that people coming in to vote are also minimize the risk of transmission?
Yeah, I think what you need is an all of the above strategy. So vote by mail actually has a very positive impact on election day voting, because if a lot of the folks who are able to vote by mail do vote by mail, then you have fewer voters that you have to accommodate through the in-person voting system. So mailing out the applications in this case, honestly, I think it should be ballots. When we've done this well in other states, they mail everybody a ballot. But anyway, you have a vote by mail system that takes those people out of the system and makes it easier. So think about traffic on a Friday, right? When you have fewer people going to work, everybody can move through the system faster. This is like giving a bunch of people Friday off, right? So you have a bunch of people vote by mail. Then you want to extend early voting as widely as you can. You want to make it easier for people to vote on the weekends and on evenings. And the best way to make in-person voting safe is to spread it out, right? Not as many people at any one time. And if you can accommodate a lot of people through early voting, then there are fewer people who need to do the in-person voting on election day. And then on election day, you need enough poll workers. So we got to worry about poll worker recruitment. You need enough polling places. So if you hear people talking about closing down polling locations, push back, right? We should be talking about moving them if they're in a senior center. But frankly, not many of the polling locations are in senior centers or nursing homes. In our study, it was 2.5%. So the vast majority of polling locations actually can be safe on election day. But if you're going to change a polling location, move it as opposed to closing it, and communicate very clearly with people what the new rules are. And then, of course, you need PPE, you need social distancing measures, you need to make sure that the folks who are, I call poll workers the heroes of democracy. I mean, these are people who are they're doing their civic duty. It's a very important role. I never would disparage the work that they're doing. We need to make sure that it's safe for folks who are participating in the elections in those ways. We need them to have enough PPEs. We need enough, cleaning processes and masks and all of that. So, but it comes down to capacity, right? If you have enough poll workers and enough places, and you spread out the voting enough, it should be easy to get people in and out safely. And then we need to communicate to people that it is safe, because one of the ways that the vote gets suppressed is when people think that it's going to be hard to vote. So we need to make it true that it's going to be safe and easy to vote, but then we need to tell people that it's going to be safe and easy to vote. Right.
And so for our purposes here in Massachusetts, the law that was signed yesterday, we've made some of those things happen. So you mentioned everybody's going to be sent an absentee ballot application, which is something that I think I agree with you. It would have been probably better in terms of participation if everybody got a ballot, but we have what we have right now. And I think it's going to be some education for people to make sure that they know that that's what they're getting and not a ballot, right? We're going to need to make sure that people know that, you're going to get something and you're going to have to do something with it. And then you'll get an actual ballot, later. So don't wait to fill out that thing thinking it's your ballot. Fill that out as soon as you can, because otherwise, you might not get your ballot back in time. So there's some education that we're going to have to do for people along that. And I was reading today that the legislation says that by July 15th, the secretary is supposed to send that out. But there was some question about whether there was enough money to do that just today. And I was wondering, did you have any insight into that? I just read it coming across my desk just an hour or two ago. There's something about...
I do. So, I think there are a couple different ways to think about this. The first is that there are a couple sources of funding that I think are available for this. One is that there's some money that was allocated to Massachusetts under the Help America Votes Act that I think could be used for this purpose. There's also some money under the CARES Act, which was the Recovery Act related to coronavirus, that I think can be used for this. So there are some resources. I mean, the reality is this is a big lift. It's a big lift to do quickly. And municipal budgets are strapped and the state budget is strapped, and it's going to be hard. It's just going to be hard. And we need to do the work that we need to do to make democracy work. But we have to know that the resources are going to be tough, and that we're calling on local election officials to do more. Candidly, one of the reasons to send everybody a ballot instead of an application is that there's less paperwork and you need fewer resources for the local election officials to do some of that work. But that's water under the bridge. The fact is that we need to equip our local election officials with the resources that they need to do this well, so that folks can vote, and it's going to be low.
And so when they actually do get that ballot will be postage paid, so that there will be no cost to the voter, thanks to the legislation. There will be an opportunity to drop it in the mail or deliver it directly to town halls or election commissions, in a secure box. And I did see that there was some effort to reduce the burden on local clerks by letting them process those ballots before election day. in a secure way. But in those of us who have worked elections on the ground a million times know that sometime around when the lines die down, all the absentee ballots get processed one after the other into the machine. Now they'll be able to do that beforehand, which will save some time on election day, especially if now. Was there any results of the town election, the spring town elections that were held in terms of the rates of participation by mail or in person? Was there what can we learn anything from what happened in May or earlier in June about what September and November will look like?
I think we can. I think that there's a real appetite to vote by mail. I think we saw that. We had a special election in the Cape. We had a special election out in the western part of the state. We had a couple of state rep races. And so we do have a little bit of a track record here in Massachusetts. And I think that we've learned that people are fairly comfortable with vote by mail, that it's something that can be done safely. That those participation rates by mail or by absentee absentee are that we can do that. And so I think that's a good thing to learn. I think that there are, the system that the legislation puts in place is a little different and will be helpful. Early vote is an extremely important step here, and the expansion of early vote, both for the primary and for the general, is a major development. I don't know if you all have voted early in person, but it's a fairly easy thing to do, and definitely sort of alleviate some of the burdens that folks feel. So now we have multiple options to vote by mail, vote early, vote in person, and I think that's going to be a real advantage for us and for election administrators, and hopefully it will cause some improvements to the system. I also think that I hesitate to say when you have an election where the turnout is somewhat high that means that there weren't problems. I think that this is a year where people understand the importance of these elections, and so I think that we would be seeing very high turnout. And we're seeing very high turnout. And I think that we're putting extraordinary burdens on voters, and we're putting disproportionate burdens on vulnerable voters. And I think that's wrong.
Mm-hmm. For the early voting, one of the things that is important to me is varying the hours when you can vote, because people who do shift work, people who can't get out on election day during voting hours, or have commutes. Some people still commute, even in these COVID times. Is there any requirement for varying the hours for that early voting in the legislation, or is that something that?
No, but there is some discretion for election officials to offer expanded early voting. One of the things that is not allowed, that I think is a problem, is I think early voting should extend to the weekend before the election. So I think a lot of people are very interested in voting the Saturday and Sunday before the election. I do think it's possible both to to allow early voting in the weekend before the election, and also to allow election day registration. And I think that we underestimate the ability of our local election officials to handle that kind of a thing. It's worked very well for, in particular, election day registration has worked very, very well in a number of states, 21 states in the state of city of DC. And in New Hampshire, they're able to do election day registration. So I think we're selling ourselves short by not sort of assuming we can do that and have early vote the weekend before the election.
Yeah, and I think for this particular election, election day registration is so important. I mean, it's September 1st is traditionally move-in day for colleges, and who knows what that's going to look like this year. But there's a lot of turnover on September 1st. So if you are moving apartments, even just moving across town, you are now either disenfranchising yourself because you've registered to vote too late to vote in the election that day, or you have to vote in the municipality or the place that you're leaving, which doesn't seem great for you or for the people who are going to be choosing that representative. All right, you want the people who are living there to choose, not the people who have left. You know, who their representation is. So I think that this time around it seemed like a missed opportunity, I'll say, to rectify that by allowing, you know, by allowing the election day registration for the primary, and then of course for the general as well. And I don't know if you
I think you're totally right. So I think we have this arbitrary voter registration cutoff that as effectively disenfranchises the people who would have wanted to register later or had circumstances that make that necessary. And as a result, we disproportionately disenfranchise a number of, again, the sort of most vulnerable folks, and often that's young people and people who move around and people of color. And what's important to highlight here is it's just not necessary, because we have this system that has worked so well across the country of allowing those folks to register, and the notion that this is not administrable is belied by the experience of so many other states. And, you know, I think, you know, this is a little bit sort of highfalutin, but, you know, Massachusetts is the oldest constitutional democracy in the world. Our constitution is the longest running constitution in the world. Our legislature is the longest running legislature, and the Supreme Judicial Court is, you know, longer than, you know, we should be a leader in democracy. We should be a leader in protecting the right to vote. And on so many levels, we just aren't. And, you know, this was a window of opportunity for us to at least catch up with some of the states that do a better job of administering elections. And, you know, I do think that on some level that was a wasted opportunity. So legislating is hard. And I really, you know, I pushed hard for this piece of legislation. I'm glad the governor signed it. I congratulate the legislators and the advocates who pushed for it. But I do think it's really important that we elect progressives like Steve Owens to go to Beacon Hill and push for us to be a leader on some of these issues. And let me just sort of talk about a little bit of the unfinished business. So we talked about election day registration. I think that this is a fundamental reform that has worked really well in other states and that is important for equity, for justice. We talked a little bit about mail-in voting and the importance of sending ballots as opposed to just applications. And the people who are left out there, right, are the people without stable addresses, the people who, you know, you make somebody do a higher burden, you're always going to have people left out. And then we need to make early voting more expansive. We need to make sure that we're protecting in-person voting. And there's just a lot of other ways. We passed this automatic voter registration system, and yet we've implemented it in a way that is not what the legislature intended, and where a lot of people are not getting enrolled in the system, and certainly not during the pandemic. So there's a lot more work to do, even to have Massachusetts catch up with other states, much less to have Massachusetts be a leader, which we could be with other reforms as well.
And I feel like the automatic voter registration should have a election day registration component to it, because if let's say I'm a, you know, relatively, maybe not completely plugged in person, but I'm plugged in enough to have heard that, oh, Massachusetts has automatic voter registration. I don't need to register, so I've been registered automatically. Well, no, not necessarily, because maybe I didn't have my driver's license renewed. Maybe I'm not on Mass Health. Maybe, maybe I didn't interact with the correct state agency to get automatically registered. And now I go to the polling place and I say, all right, well, I'm here to vote. I'm registered, right? It's automatic. And they say, no, you should have registered 20 days ago. So I feel like we're kind of we're going in the right direction, but there are really steps that we need to take to make sure that people aren't disenfranchised. So you are absolutely right. We have unfinished business for this. Rita is asking about, what can individuals do just to make sure that we can help people vote, make sure that they're their vote is protected as, you know, as just normal everyday citizens. Is there something
Yeah,
that
so
you
I mean,
would?
I think there are a couple things to do. One is I mentioned, you know, these poll worker shortages. I think that if you are in a situation to be able to volunteer to be involved as a poll worker, that's a great public service that people can do. I also have this theory that we obsess too much over battleground states. And, you know, that what we really ought to be focusing on is getting involved in our local elections. You know, support Steve Owens, support city council, candidates and county, candidates, and get involved. So if you think about the awful thing, right? I remember the morning after Trump won the presidency, having to explain to my children what had happened and what the consequences were there. And it wasn't just that we'd lost the presidency. Right? We'd lost the Senate. At the time, we'd lost the House. We'd lost the majority of the governorships and the majority of the state legislatures and the courts. And that was the culmination of a process that goes back at least 20 years, right? The Christian Coalition and Ralph Reed and the Tea Party and Newt Gingrich, and they invested in running people for office at the local level and contesting these seats, and then these down ballot races, and then they used that, right, to win the state legislatures, to gerrymander the districts, to stack the courts, to rig the campaign finance system, and a whole bunch of distortions to our democracy. And when we think about kind of how we're going to claw our way out of this mess, we have this tendency to focus on shiny objects, right? So the presidency, winning back the Senate, winning back the House, and all of those things are fundamental. I mean, look, our democracy is in deep, deep peril if we don't win the presidential race. But I think if you think about what it's going to take our country back, it's actually not that easy, right? It's going to be decades of getting more diverse candidates involved, younger candidates, first-time candidates. It's going to be running people for local offices. It's going to be getting people involved in their local democracy. And so I actually think that where ordinary citizens should focus is actually on, Watertown and Belmont and Waltham, and sort of how are we going to be involved in our own communities and making the democracy work here and getting good candidates involved and getting citizens involved here.
Well, that's great advice. So people who want to get involved locally, I do know of one campaign that could certainly use your volunteer time. But before we go, Emerson, let's make sure we get that information out. But Lauren wanted to ask about if we've kind of said that Massachusetts needs to do better. What states do you think are doing the best in maybe not in every area, but in specific areas? I know that some states, Oregon's been doing vote by mail forever, basically, and some other states have just started, like Colorado and I think Utah. But is there any lessons that we can take from those other states where what would the gold standard be for some of these?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that you're right to say that it is different for different pieces. So some of the Western states have had a very good experience with vote by mail. Their experience, belies a lot of the lies that Trump has been spewing about vote by mail. And as you mentioned, Utah is a great example, right? So in Utah, lots of people vote by mail and they vote for Republicans. It actually doesn't necessarily help Democrats. It does actually help democracy, and it's worked very well. I personally believe that the best state systems are ones that combine opportunities to vote by mail and opportunities to vote in person. There are some states that have gone pretty close to fully to vote by mail, and I think those have been successful experiments, but I think we should be thinking about a hybrid approach like we're talking about. As I mentioned, there are 21 states in the District of Columbia that have implemented election day registration. One good example of a fairly well-functioning election day administration system is right around the corner in New Hampshire. They've had,
and I think a lot of us who are activists are very familiar with going up to New Hampshire on election day or just before election day to make sure people are registered to vote and make sure that the vote is gotten out. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And election day registration works very well in New Hampshire. They have other kinds of problems. They have a tendency to suppress student votes. And, so there's a series of challenges that we fight out every year, including now on some certain issues around residency and domicile. But automatic voter registration, I mentioned, has been implemented in a more fulsome way in some other states that make it easier for people to get on the rolls. So we've got some work to do there. I personally am in favor of ranked choice voting and think that there's more that we can do to make sure that people's desires are reflected in the outcome of races, particularly in some of these very big fields where the incentives now, if you think about how Trump won the Republican nomination in 2016, he was not a consensus candidate. He was a candidate that was able to get a passionate set of voices in a plurality and then wedge out to get his nomination. But in a ranked choice voting system, you would have had a different outcome in that primary fight. You would make it easier for people to vote for who they truly believe in rather than who they believe is most electable. And they may still end up with the candidate that they prefer, or at least that they prefer to the other alternatives. So I think we'll have an interesting conversation in Massachusetts, hopefully over the next couple of years, about ranked choice voting. But I would encourage people to look seriously at that as a potential.
Well, and that, my understanding is that's going to be on the ballot as well this year. That the ranked choice voting folks have gotten all the signatures that they needed, and assuming everything goes, there are no other issues, that we'll see that as a ballot question this year. And I think, I encourage everybody to vote. I'm also in favor of ranked choice voting. I was, if we look at just the recent examples now of the 5th district congressional primary, I was watching, checking ballots up for the recount for that up in Lowell, and you could see when you looked at the ballots, you don't usually get to look at ballots, but because there was a recount, you could look at the ballot. People checked more than one. People are ready for this, ready for ranked choice voting. Those ballots, of course, were kicked out. They were spoiled. So those people who wanted to vote for more than one candidate couldn't because the system didn't allow it. But it seems like people were ready for that in Lowell, and that's why you saw an extra 1,000 blanks in that city when they had their election. And now you look at the 4th district, the seat that Joe Kennedy, Representative Kennedy, is retiring from, or moving on from, I should say. How many? There are 10 candidates for that now. It seems.
Yeah, something like
9.
that. It's a big.
It's also a very. I think one may have just. But there's a very big field there, and the winner of that may also have 12, 15% of the vote, which seems like a great fit for being able to rank your choices. When you have such a big field, to be able to say, well, I like these more than the rest of these, and then we'll see what happens and what comes out of that. I think that's really really important, and really it really prevents a small minority from getting their candidate in, even if 75% or 80% of the people don't want that person to win. Diana is asking what the single biggest hurdle. So what's and this might be different when you're talking locally versus nationally. But what's stopping the effort to make sure that everybody can vote?
So to me, historically, the answer is lines. So I was the voter protection director for the Obama campaign in 2008 in Ohio. And if you remember in 2004, a big part of the reason why George W. Bush beat John Kerry was because there were very, very long lines in African-American communities in Cleveland and in Columbus. And we were obsessed with the idea that wasn't going to happen on our watch to Obama. And, we were very focused on sort of what do we need to do to make sure that folks don't wait in those lines. But if you look at kind of what happened in Georgia last week or 2 weeks ago, African Americans wait in really long lines, students wait in really long lines, and that has a huge impact on the vote. So that's historically, I think, what I'm been most worried about. In 2020, I'm also quite worried about disinformation. So I think that, we have a foreign adversary that has assisted the Trump campaign in trying to affect the election in 2016. We were surprised as a community by the effectiveness or the scope of the micro-targeted misinformation. We shouldn't be surprised that in 2020 this is going to be a key part of their strategy, right? They've boasted that they have a Death Star campaign of digital advertising, that it is very well financed. It is going to be very focused on micro-targeting disinformation at vulnerable voters. And I expect that a big piece of that is going to be around the pandemic, right? So they're going to say your polling place was closed, the election was canceled, we're doing social distancing, Republicans vote on Tuesdays, Democrats vote on Wednesdays. Or they're going to say, Joe Biden, is losing his mental acuity and had to drop out, or, something, right? So the use of Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, to some extent Twitter, as vehicles for micro-targeted disinformation. I worry about that much more than I worry about things like hacking of machines. For the most part, hacking of machines is hard and hard to do effectively. Whereas micro-targeting vulnerable communities on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok and targeting them with misinformation, actually not that hard, very prevalent, and very hard to stop.
And it seems like having a little bit of background in computers, it's much more easy to hack a person, than it is a machine in some cases. So hacking the electorate is something that we should definitely be worried about. And if there's one silver lining to the fact that we have this patchwork of electoral systems throughout the country, it's that the economies of scale in attacking, one particular county or one particular election system, it doesn't scale as well because everything is so different. The system that we use in Massachusetts is different, town by town in some cases. I think in Carlisle they still use the same, hand crank machine that they've used for the past 100 years. So that one you can't, the Russians can't hack that one for sure. But if there's one silver lining to it being such a patchwork system of different ways of voting and different types of ballots and machines and scantrons and whatever, it's that it's harder for a coordinated attack outside to not be to be feasible on a grand scale. And you can maybe change a couple of votes here or there, but it seems hard to change a whole state. The more dissimilar the systems are within one. So, okay, that was Rita was saying, was encouraging us. Okay, good. Well, I think we do have to worry about it. I think Facebook has actually gotten worse on this over the years. In my experience, 10 years ago, Facebook was just, seeing what your college friends were up to, 5 years later or 10 years later, or your high school friends or whatever. And now it seems like they're really pushing the groups so that you really live in a bubble, a Facebook bubble. You don't see much, information. You can really, isolate yourself in those things. So getting at that sort of, breaking through those bubbles, I think is going to be difficult, and especially when you're talking about the disinformation that you were, the last minute, campaigns to make sure that nobody knows what's going on, or trying to feed people false information about that. That's something that I think we really need to be on top of, and just make sure that we can inoculate people to that to some extent beforehand.
I think that's exactly right. So I have an op-ed that we're working on this topic. But I think there are three things that you can do. The first is that the best solution to disinformation is proactive, good information. So we need to educate voters about what is true information to the extent that there are changes to the election laws, which there are in many places, or changes to polling places. We need to get that information out very accurately. We need to have a listening network, so we need ears to the ground all over the country, and we need a rapid response system to be able to reply to some of that. And then we need journalists and social media networks and election officials to be proactive in putting out good information. We need the social media networks, as you mentioned, Steve, to enforce their rules proactively and fairly. We also need journalists to get over this both sides stuff, right? So when Donald Trump lies about vote by mail, even if he does it from an official source, that should not be given equal credence to the Brennan Center or the Bipartisan Policy Center, which have actually studied these things. And, I think we've seen this a little bit in the climate crisis, where there's this tendency of journalists to think that the way to be fair is to have equal airtime. But honestly, in this environment, both sides are not equally working in good faith. And when that's the case, journalists do need to say, actually, there's some facts here, and the facts may be on one side. And the reality is that we have one party that's been hijacked. And it has decided that its strategy for holding on to power, despite not having the majority of the country in its corner, is to make it harder for some people to vote and to rig the districts and to rig the courts. And if they're allowed to get away with that, the journalists will have abandoned their sacred duty.
Well, on that hopeful note,
I am hopeful, actually, but there's a lot of work to do.
One of the things along those lines, and we could have another conversation about this, is the kind of the slow eroding of our local journalism. Not just here locally. I mean, the number of local daily papers has been, the ownership has been consolidated locally. All the regional and town papers, for example, were all owned by the same company, and they're shared. They have one editor for 3 towns or something like that. But we can talk about that for a long time. That can be a topic for another week, because we are running a little bit low on time. But I do worry about that a lot. So anyway, to find out more about the Voter Protection Corps, where should people go?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. So the Voter Protection Corps is voter-protection.org, and we'd love to have your time and love to talk further. I'm qpalfrey@gmail.com, but I want to encourage you to support Steve, to support progressive leaders. I think that the answer to a lot of these problems is actually a long-term fight. It's going to be electing progressive leaders who are going to go for the long haul to reclaiming our democracy and getting involved at the local level. So thank you, Steve, for your leadership. I'm behind you all the way, and encourage folks to chip into Steve's campaign and help out as we get this over the finish line.
Well, thank you so much, Quentin. I really appreciate your support. I appreciate your help. I appreciate your time here today. For more information about me, you can go to votesteveowens.com. There's information about how you can volunteer or donate on the website. And as we said, start local. Start supporting local progressive leaders is how we're going to slowly get out of this situation. So
just a shout out to Jonathan Heck too, has been terrific in this seat. You've been so lucky to have wonderful leadership, and Steve has big shoes to fill, but I can't think of anybody better to fill them.
Well, that's high praise. Representative Hecht has certainly been a rock star here in Watertown and Cambridge, and we are sad to see him go. But I'm excited to follow in his footsteps as we go forward. So thank you to everybody. And if there's anything else, you can contact me on the Facebook or at my website, votesteveowens.com. So thanks so much. Oh, next week, Tuesday at 1 o'clock, we have Representative Maria Robinson. We're going to be talking about some environmental legislation that we'll see what is cooking in the State House on those environmental issues, and whatever else happens to be ready for them to vote on at the time. So next week, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Rep. Maria Robinson, really excited to talk to her about the environment. So thank you, and I'll see you all next week, if not sooner. So thanks again.